What if the Titanic was already damaged before it ever hit the iceberg? Some researchers now believe the disaster may not have started at the moment of impact. Instead, the ship could have been carrying a hidden weakness across the Atlantic, one that made the collision far more deadly than it should have been. This idea sounds extreme, but it is based on real evidence. Historical records confirm that a coal bunker fire was burning inside the Titanic for days before the ship even left port. Fires like this were not unusual at the time, but in this case, the location and duration of the fire have raised serious questions. According to reports, the fire was located in one of the coal storage areas along the ship's hull. Temperatures inside coal fires can exceed 1,000 degrees Celsius, which is high enough to weaken steel if the heat is sustained over time. Crew members worked to control the fire during the voyage, but it was not fully extinguished before the collision. Some researchers argue that this heat may have compromised a section of the hull from the inside. There is also visual evidence that keeps this theory alive. Photographs taken before the Titanic left port show a dark streak along the hull, close to the area where the iceberg later struck. Some analysts believe this mark could indicate heat damage caused by the fire inside the ship. If that section of the hull was already weakened, even slightly, it could have changed how the metal responded during the collision. The iceberg impact itself did not create a single large hole. Instead, it caused a series of narrow openings along the hull, stretching across roughly 90 meters. These small breaches allowed water to enter multiple compartments at the same time. The Titanic was designed to stay afloat, with up to 4 flooded compartments. But during the disaster, at least 6 compartments were breached. That difference is critical. According to modern reconstructions, water began flooding the forward compartments almost immediately after the collision. The first sections likely filled within 10 to 15 minutes, causing the bow to slowly dip lower into the ocean. As the angle increased, water spilled from one compartment into the next, accelerating the process. In total, it took about 2 hours and 40 minutes for the Titanic to go from a fully operational ship to complete structural failure. If the hull had already been weakened before impact, it could have allowed more water to enter faster, reducing the time available for evacuation. However, this theory is still debated. Many engineers argue that the coal fire alone would not have caused enough structural damage to significantly weaken the hull. Steel used in shipbuilding at the time could tolerate high temperatures for limited periods, and there is no direct physical evidence proving that the fire caused critical failure. Other studies point to different factors. Tests on recovered materials show that some of the Titanic's rivets and steel plates may have been more brittle in cold conditions. The water temperature in the North Atlantic that night was around 2 degrees Celsius, which could have made the metal more prone to cracking during impact. Speed also played a major role. The Titanic was traveling at about 22 knots, close to its maximum speed. At that velocity, even a glancing collision with an iceberg would produce a long series of fractures along the hull rather than one clean break. Modern simulations show that even without any prior damage, the iceberg alone was enough to sink the ship. The pattern of flooding and the timeline of the sinking match what engineers would expect from the known damage. This means the hidden hole theory is not required to explain the disaster. But it does highlight something important. The sinking of the Titanic was not caused by a single mistake or a single event. It was the result of multiple factors happening at the same time. Speed, temperature, material limits, compartment design, and possibly internal damage all combined in a way that the ship could not survive. More than 110 years later, the Titanic is still being studied using deep-sea imaging and advanced simulations. Each new analysis adds detail to what happened during those final hours. The idea that the ship may have already been weakened before the iceberg keeps coming back for one reason. Because even small hidden flaws can have massive consequences under extreme conditions.
exclusive photographs, by far the best yet, are in from the Titanic. For most of this century, that...
When the first images of the Titanic shipwreck appeared in September 1985, the world stopped. People were glued to their TVs, watching the legendary ship reappear after more than 70 years. Where did the Titanic sink, you ask? It's located about 400 miles off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada. This so-called unsinkable ship rests in complete darkness, about 12,600 feet below the surface. Yep, that's how deep the Titanic is. But even after such a long fall down to the ocean floor, the front part, known as the bow, still looks surprisingly intact. I mean, the railings were still there, the anchor chains too, even the elegant curves of the hull you might recognize from old photos. But the news barely mentioned the stern back then, and there's a reason we still don't talk much about it. You see, these images were about more than just capturing mesmerizing and eerie footage. They were proof of what really happened when the Titanic sank. We were finally getting some answers about this 1912 disaster, when more than 1,600 people lost their lives. And before you Google how many people survived the Titanic, I'll tell you, 706. Among those survivors, several claimed they saw the ship break apart as it went down. Others insisted it sank in one piece, and in the end, investigators agreed with them. Back then, official reports concluded that Titanic had gone down intact. So, for 73 years, that was the official story, until we finally saw the Titanic at the bottom of the ocean. When the Titanic underwater photos were released, they confirmed it. Yes, the liner really did break apart as it sank. And if we've just seen those images of the bow, that means the stern must be around there too, right? Well, kind of. I mean, we did find it. It's located about 2,000 feet away from the bow, lying on the ocean floor. So yes, it exists. But why doesn't anyone ever talk about what happened to the stern of the Titanic? Well, there's a big reason for that. See, the bow, even after all the damage from hitting the seafloor, still looks recognizable. Many of its interiors are surprisingly well preserved, and it's lying as if the ship was continuing its voyage. But the stern is destroyed. Today it's more like a twisted tangle of steel that barely looks like a ship at all. Only the parts that are more resilient, like the propellers, reciprocating engines, and rudder, have managed to hold their shape. But the rest of the stern section is melting into the seafloor. Yet, to understand why it's in such a terrible state, we need to go back to that freezing night of April 15, 1912, the night of the Titanic wreck. Just hours before the tragedy, Titanic was still sailing smoothly across the cold North Atlantic. The stern was alive with people, families talking, music playing, life going on as usual. This is where the room for passengers with the cheapest tickets were located. That's why third-class travelers were also known as steerage passengers. But the stern wasn't only for passengers. It also contained many of the ship's storage areas, including cargo holds, baggage rooms, kitchens, crew quarters, and even the engineering spaces. And hold on to that info, it's going to be important in a second. So let's jump straight to when the liner struck the iceberg. As the bow began to sink, the stern slowly lifted out of the water, putting enormous strain on the middle of the ship. By around 2 in the morning, the lights on Titanic flickered and then went out. Moments later, the ship broke in two, and the bow disappeared beneath the waves. The stern briefly settled back on the water before rising again, this time almost vertical. It stayed upright for a few seconds and then began its final plunge. At about 2:20 in the morning, the stern vanished beneath the Atlantic. Titanic was gone. What was happening beneath the water were two completely different scenarios. First, the bow slowly filled with water and began to drift downward, almost sailing gently like a submarine. Because of that, it managed to keep its shape and stayed mostly intact. But Titanic's stern collapse was a whole different story. The stern was ripped wide open where the ship had split apart. Water rushed in through that open end at incredible speed. This sudden flooding made the stern plunge downward much faster than the bow. The rush of water created so much turbulence that pieces were ripped off and scattered all around the ocean floor. Now, remember what I said earlier about the spaces inside the stern? Those huge storage areas were wide open, and many of them contained air pockets. So when the stern section broke away, it still had compartments filled with trapped air. As it spun down into the depths, this increasing water pressure crushed those pockets one by one. The surrounding structure began to implode, scattering pieces of metal, furniture, statues, and passengers' belongings across the ocean floor. So many experts believe the immense water pressure made that section collapse as it sank, and that's why we can't see much of it today. And now you know the answer to the Titanic back section mystery. We don't talk about it much, simply because there's not much left to see. It's like the part of the Titanic story that's too broken or too painful to talk about openly. The side of the ship that truly feels lost. And sorry to say this, but that's the future of the bow, too. I mean, it won't be there forever. The iconic shape of the wreck is changing year after year, and not in a good way. The front part of the Titanic is deteriorating, and one day it'll be entirely gone. Down on the seabed, the Titanic faces enormous pressure, nearly 390 times greater than at the surface. The good news is there aren't any air pockets left inside the ship, so big implosions won't happen again. But the bad news is that the ship's own weight is now helping to tear it apart. As those 52,000 tons of steel slowly settle into the ocean floor, they twist and pull on the hull. Submersible missions have already spotted large cracks running through the steel plates, and even the decks themselves are starting to cave in. And there's something else. The wreck might look cool and spooky today, but that actually comes from a thick layer of bacteria and microbes covering it. The problem is, they're slowly eating the Titanic. Yep, most of the corrosion happening down there is caused by bacteria, and this is gradually weakening the entire structure. Steel plates, beams, and supports are getting thinner every year. Scientists estimate that the ship is losing between 0.13 and 0.2 tons of iron every single day. Still, even at that rate, the wreck won't vanish overnight. Experts believe it could take up to 420 years for the liner to disappear completely. Until then, we'll keep watching this sad but natural process unfold. Parts of the ship have been falling apart little by little since the night when Titanic sank, and a lot has already changed since we started taking underwater photos, like the railing sections that have dropped and the ceiling in the captain's bathroom that's collapsed. That's why so many expeditions are now focused on capturing footage and detailed scans of the Titanic shipwreck, to preserve its memory before the ocean takes it all. It's our way of keeping the story alive, even as time and nature continue their quiet work. Maybe those hungry bacteria can take a break from their buffet, so that Titanic can rest in peace with many more years to come.
There were no binoculars on board the famous Titanic on the night when they were needed the most. The lookouts were blind, helpless, and doomed, and the ship went down, taking hundreds of lives, right? Well, it's just one of the many myths from a whole ocean of half-truths, rumors, and dramatic retellings the Titanic is still sailing in. There were binoculars on board. The real issue was access. The binoculars were locked in a cabinet in the crow's nest, which is the lookout point, but the key went missing. A crew member named David Blair, who was supposed to be on the Titanic, was reassigned to a different ship at the last minute. He forgot to leave the key behind. The key to saving hundreds of lives, literally, was sitting in his pocket far away as the Titanic was going down. But we'll never find out what would have happened if the key had been there. The sky was clear that night, but there wasn't a moon to light the way, and there was no wind, so the sea was glassy, and there were no ripples, which are the usual warning signs of icebergs floating around. Then there's the idea that the Titanic was racing across the Atlantic to break a speed record, but historians disagree. The Titanic's crew knew there was ice out there, but instead of slowing down, they just kept going. cruising around 22 knots. That's only a couple of knots slower than her top speed, but the Titanic wasn't being pushed to her limits. Many of her furnaces weren't even fully stoked.
And it was normal practice for that time to just keep going and trust those on the lookout to spot the ice before the ship hits it. Those massive Atlantic liners weren't about taking it easy. They were about being perfectly on time. Ships like the Titanic were basically the express trains of the sea, and any delay would have been a PR disaster. So, yeah, they knew the risks, but didn't think it was a big deal. After all, plenty of ships had close calls before and came out okay. They didn't see ice as a huge threat those days, and weren't even afraid of head-on collisions. And have you heard that the White Star Line, the company that owned the Titanic, marketed it as unsinkable? In 1910, the company was hyping up their two new ocean giants, the Titanic and her sister ship, the Olympic. Their ads proudly declared these ships were designed to be unsinkable. What the company meant by it was that, on paper, the design should keep them afloat. Later on, they even had to clarify that they never promised the ships were actually unsinkable. By 1911, before the Titanic even hit the water, magazines were already running wild with the idea. Writers were calling her practically unsinkable, pointing to her fancy new watertight compartments as proof. And just like that, a legend was born before the ship even left the dock. After she went down, even one of White Star Line's own executives admitted during the official inquiry that when he first heard the news, he didn't believe it. He genuinely believed the Titanic couldn't sink. But that whole unsinkable thing was never the main selling point. White Star Line wasn't really pushing safety, but selling luxury. The Titanic was supposed to be the crown jewel of ocean travel, massive, elegant, and dripping in comfort. Another story that just stuck with us is that before the iceberg even struck, a coal fire was burning away in one of the Titanic's bunkers. It weakened the ship's hull and made it more vulnerable. Some people even say that fire caused or accelerated the sinking. Well, it's partially true. There was a coal fire in one of the Titanic's coal bunkers before the voyage. Fires in coal bunkers weren't unusual in steamships of the time. They could smolder for days. But it was nothing like a fire that would be raging uncontrollably. Historical timelines, crew logs, and structural analysis all indicate that a fire of such intensity and in such a position couldn't have caused fatal structural damage. If the fire had done that much harm, the ship might have failed even before the collision. But the Titanic stayed afloat for over 2 hours, which means the real villain was still the iceberg. Another twist to the fire story is that it could have distracted the crew, preventing them from dealing with the iceberg situation properly. That sounds more plausible, but still, that's not the same as saying the fire was the real culprit. Speaking of the real culprits, there's no doubt it was an iceberg, but the scale of disaster it caused was way more subtle than a big movie-style gash in the hull. Instead, it produced many tiny fractures in the ship's rivets, seams, and metal joints. Each fracture was almost unnoticeable, but because the ship was cruising, the water was steadily running through those micro gaps under pressure. It slowly seeped into multiple compartments and filled 6 of the watertight sections. The Titanic lingered, hovered, took on water, and was failing compartment after compartment. She sank over a period of 2 hours, rather than going down in minutes. If the iceberg had catastrophically torn open the hull, the ship would have gone down almost immediately, and people would have had no time to react and escape. Sadly, not all of them had that chance anyway. You probably recall the heartbreaking scene from the Titanic movie, where third-class passengers attempt to escape to the decks, but they are locked below in their section. Well, it's only partially true. Yes, there were barriers separating passenger classes, but they were mostly in place to comply with U.S. immigration laws. Third-class passengers going to America in search of a new life had to pass health checks and immigration processing. That's why they were traveling on separate decks. There were some lifeboats for them, although not in the third-class sections of the ship, so they would have to navigate a maze of corridors and stairs to reach the top. And many of the third-class passengers didn't even want to try, as they didn't want to leave their luggage behind. In the end, only about a quarter of the third-class passengers survived, but no one forcefully kept them on the lower decks. Now let's switch gears and discuss the Titanic facts that people used to deny or overlook, but which have since been proven true. For example, most deck plans and diagrams you've seen in Titanic documentaries don't show a hidden deck down under the waterline called the inner bottom. Many outside engineers did not fully understand or discuss it. This hidden deck stretched nearly the full length of the ship and had 44 separate watertight tanks. Most of them were for water ballast, some for fresh water. There were also wing tanks, port and starboard, which helped with balance. The inner bottom was like the ship's built-in organizer. It divided the Titanic into separate sections, allowing different parts to remain balanced and easier to control. It was designed to stay afloat with up to 4 of the forward compartments flooded. Sadly, the rendezvous with the iceberg opened 6 compartments, and you know what happened next. And finally, my personal favorite Titanic myth is that the ship split cleanly in half, like some Hollywood action scene. Blame James Cameron for that one. We all cried when we saw it, but reality was way uglier. For many years after the tragedy, survivors couldn't all agree on what they saw. Some said the ship went down whole. Others swore it broke apart. No one believed the second group until the scientists found the wreck in 1985. Then, they finally confirmed the truth that the Titanic had indeed broken in two, but not neatly. The metal twisted, tore, and shredded as the stern lifted into the air, and 2 opposite forces ripped it apart. And to make it even more tragic, the people were still clinging to the back half when it snapped and plunged into darkness.
Titanic.
The Titanic.
The Titanic.
The Titanic.
Titanic.
The Titanic.
The Titanic.
Titanic.
The Titanic.
Congratulations! You can now forget everything you've seen in the movies or everything you've read in books and newspapers and heard from people. Now we have the most detailed and reliable study of the famous sunken ship. A large-scale Titanic 3D scan allows us to see in fine detail everything that happened during the disaster. And rest assured, there was a lot going on there that you've never heard of. Are you ready for Titanic new discoveries? Let's go! There's a fat chance, or a thin chance, take your pick, that there are no people here who haven't heard of what happened. But just in case, here's the quick backstory. On April 10, 1912, the giant cruise ship Titanic sailed from Southampton, England to New York City. 4 days later, the ship collided with an iceberg and sank in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. It was one of the most tragic and biggest disasters in the history of sea voyages. Since then, the wreck of the giant ship has been lying under a layer of icy water. For decades, people wanted to get the ship from the bottom many times, but they never fully tried. Passenger stories, documentaries, and books have given us a complete picture of what happened. But the only witness that can tell us about those tragic events is the ship itself. And some people decided to ask it about that night. A group of experts, oceanographers and cinematographers, recreated a virtual version of the events and showed it in the documentary Titanic: The Digital Resurrection. This is the most detailed digital reconstruction of how the Titanic sank ever made. To create it, specialists from the Magellan Company sent marine robots to the bottom where the ship lies at a depth of 12,500 feet. In such a place, all objects experience immense water pressure. To better understand how great it is, imagine the weight of a heavy barbell on your fingertip. Experienced divers with standard scuba gear can only swim at depths up to 130 feet and a little deeper. So it's a challenging, almost impossible mission to descend to such a depth and conduct research. It's dangerous for people. That's why the team of specialists sent robots there. Equipped with cameras for deep-sea surveys, they took more than 700,000 photos and videos in 4K resolution. They were collecting data for 3 weeks, exploring every part of the ship. Eventually, they had about 16 terabytes of data. Now, 1 terabyte is 1,000 gigabytes. Is that a lot? The largest game on PC, Microsoft Flight Simulator, weighs about a half a terabyte, and it has maps of the entire planet to create a realistic flight simulator. Still, this huge program weighs 32 times less than that Titanic scan. Imagine how detailed the model of the ship and the simulation of the disaster turned out to be. Moreover, the team combined all this information with the drawings of the ship. They calculated the speed of Titanic that night, its direction, its position, and the angle of impact with the iceberg. All of this was uploaded to supercomputers to create precise crash simulations. After that, specialists studied eyewitness reports, got consultations from historians and maritime experts, and then presented a detailed staging of the tragic night. Some things turned out to be different from what you know about them. For example, the iceberg didn't make a huge hole in the side of the ship. A Titanic wreckage scan shows that a piece of ice had struck a glancing blow and created several holes in the hull. Each of them was the size of an A4 sheet of paper. How could such minor damage destroy a giant ship? The problem was that those A4-sized punctures covered the entire length of the case. The Titanic's creators claimed that it was the most unsinkable ship in the world. However, its unsinkability lay in the fact that it could stay afloat even if 4 of its watertight compartments got flooded. But the collision with the iceberg led to the flooding of 6 of them. The iceberg had a mere 6.3 seconds of contact with the ship and still managed to sink it. The Titanic wreckage scan also showed a portal with a broken window. The iceberg probably crashed in there. This finding confirms the words of eyewitnesses that pieces of ice got into the cabins. Just imagine how frightening that was. You're sleeping peacefully in your bed, then you hear a loud crash, and a piece of iceberg falls into your cabin. And after that, absolute chaos begins. The researchers found out exactly how the ship had split in half. In the famous movie, we all saw how the back of the ship had risen above the water and then broken off. The ship indeed broke, but not as gently as we saw on the screen. Yeah, the scale of the disaster was terrible, but the reality was even worse. The ship wasn't just broken, it was torn in two. Wooden and metal parts of the ship, pipes, chunks of the hull, walls, everything was torn and bent. The first-class cabins were torn in two. Imagine the screeching of metal that sounded on that cold night. Researchers compared other Titanic facts versus the movie. One of them was a story about First Officer William Murdoch. In the movie, his character attacked passengers who were trying to board the boat. But in reality, everything happened differently. Titanic survivor Charles Lightoller said William Murdoch had drowned when he was trying to lower a lifeboat into the water. He didn't attack anybody, but still faced a tragic fate. There are no exact details, but high-resolution scans have confirmed this version. But one of the most impressive and heroic tales that happened on the Titanic occurred in the boiler room. With the help of robots, experts discovered that one of the boat's steam valves had been left open. This finding only confirms eyewitness stories that the engineers stayed in the boiler room for more than 2 hours after the collision with the icebergs. This group of brave people maintained a power supply until the very end. Why did they do it? Proper lighting on the Titanic helped people safely lower the boats onto the water. Electric power also made the Titanic visible to distant ships. Moreover, passengers reported that the Titanic's lights were on even when it was submerged underwater. The brave feat of the engineers helped save hundreds of passengers' lives. Who knows, perhaps further research of the ship will tell us more about other heroic actions of the passengers and crew members. Actions that will be worth making a movie about. In addition to studying the ship, the researchers also scanned the seabed around the wreckage, where not only parts of the Titanic, but also personal belongings of passengers, including gold coins, pocket watches, combs, shoes, and so on, were scattered. By the way, many of those items have been raised from the bottom and sold at various auctions. You can also see some artifacts from the ship in specialized museums. One of those is called Titanic Belfast and is located in Northern Ireland. It is open to the public. A digital replica of the ship not only shows us how the Titanic sank, but also literally saves the ship. The condition of the wreckage is getting worse every day. Gigantic pressure, cold temperature, water, and marine life, all of this is slowly destroying the vessel. Oh yeah, some companies that organize dive trips to the ship for tourists also pose a danger to the ship. It turns out that there are a lot of people who wanted to go down inside a submersible to the legendary wreck. As a result of some of these excursions, parts of the ship were damaged. Experts predict that within the next 40 years, the unlucky liner may disappear completely. Fortunately, the Titanic 3D scan has provided such a level of detail that you can imagine walking inside it. This means that the tragedy will never be forgotten. Of course, 10 videos like this one won't be enough to cover the full scope of the work that the filmmakers have done. Fortunately, the documentary, Titanic: The Digital Resurrection, is available for viewing. You can watch the movie and also study the 3D models of the ship. Who knows? Perhaps you can make new discoveries.